Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello, 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 and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Today, two great guests, old friends of the show. The first hour, we're going to be speaking with Michael Cremo about the extreme antiquity of the human race, and in the second hour, with Daniel Brinkley about 2012 and the changing face of time. Don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com, where you can find out about all the services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, intuitive counseling, as well as energy healing. You can find out all about that at SoulHealer.com. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's AppliedEnergeticsInstitute.com. And to keep informed of all the upcoming shows we do have lined up, go to the Just Energy Radio webpage, that's www.justenergyradio.com, and sign up for our newsletter. It comes out once a week, and you will be kept informed of all the guests that are coming up. You can also go to the Just Energy Radio website and check out our over 5 years of archives, including programming with the guests, Michael Cremo and Daniel Brinkley, when they've been on the show before talking about other fantastic topics. So let me tell you a little bit about Michael and bring him on the show. Michael Cremo is on the cutting edge of science and culture. In the course of a few months' time, he might be found on pilgrimage to sacred sites in India, appearing on a national television show, lecturing at a mainstream science conference, or speaking to an alternative science gathering. As he crosses disciplinary and cultural boundaries, he presents to his various audiences a compelling case for negotiating a new consensus on the nature of reality. So the author of Forbidden Archaeology, Michael Cremo. Hey, Michael, how are you?
Good to be with you and all your listeners.
You know, I always love having you come on because you always have all of these facts and know all of the stuff, and today will be no change because I'm ready for you, Michael, and I'm lined up with some good questions. But today, you know, we've kind of talked about, the forbidden archaeology aspect, about the things that people really don't want to talk about or don't want talked about. But I wanted to explore a couple of different things, and where I wanted to start was with some of the anomalous artifacts, and there are images of some of them on your Forbidden Archaeology page, forbiddenarchaeology.com, that I thought would be a good starting point, because you might see these images, but they go a lot deeper. And I guess really where I want to start is, you've been on the Ancient Aliens series, and a number of people we've had on the show have been on the Ancient Aliens series, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like where you believe our history started actually goes back much further in time than that show leads us to believe, which, according to a lot of alternative historians, is, 40,000 years ago, kind of with the advent of Cro-Magnon man. But it sounds like with what you've uncovered, it actually goes back much further in time. Would that be a true statement?
Yeah, I was happy to appear on the Ancient Aliens series on the History Channel. It was really great. My question was, how ancient are the contacts, between extraterrestrials and humans on this planet? And I get a lot of my ideas about this whole topic from the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, which speak, first of all, of a very ancient human presence on this planet, but they also speak about a very ancient presence of extraterrestrials visiting this planet. For example, there's one historical account in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. It's about a king named Dhruva who lived on this planet, according to these ancient Sanskrit writings of India, almost 2 billion years ago. Now, that is really astonishing in terms of modern understanding, because most modern scientists would think human beings first came into existence about 200,000 years ago on this planet. But these ancient Sanskrit writings give far more ancient histories, and they involve extraterrestrial contacts also. This king, Dhruva, was taken by a spacecraft through the different levels of the cosmos to a completely different world. There are descriptions of this, detailed descriptions of this, given in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India that stated how a glowing spacecraft came down to Earth, and the spacecraft was piloted by 2 glowing beings. And in order to enter this spacecraft, his body had to be transformed to a higher energy level. And then he was taken into this spacecraft and taken to a whole other dimension of reality. So there's an elaborate description of this in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. And they also give the time. Of course, they have a cyclical concept of time. Many cultures have a cyclical concept of time. The Mayan culture has a cyclical concept of time. The ancient Greeks and Romans had a cyclical concept of time. So the people in ancient India, they had a cyclical concept of time. And the cycles repeat again and again over vast periods of time, going back millions of years, even billions of years. So according to the cosmological calendar of ancient India, this visitation of a spacecraft to Earth, which took the king Dhruva to a higher dimension of reality, took place about 2 billion years ago. So my point would be, yeah, there are ancient aliens, but I don't think we even imagine how ancient the contacts could be between humans on this Earth and extraterrestrial beings.
I totally agree. When you read some of the mythology, the beings that you are introduced to in no way, shape, or form take on the appearance of being human. They might be monsters, they might have multiple heads, lots of arms, they might be a dwarf. We have the Nagas, the serpent people, that it's, to me, hard-pressed to say this is all just of their imagination.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I have an expanded conception of what it means to be an extraterrestrial. Some people, just by extraterrestrials, they just mean just other flesh and blood creatures like ourselves, maybe a little bit different, in the form of the classic gray aliens, with the bulbous heads and big eyes and things like that. But basically, they're flesh and blood types of human beings. But my picture of what extraterrestrials are involves understanding there are different levels of the cosmos with different levels of energies, some more subtle. So some of these higher beings, they originate, not as flesh and blood creatures from another planet or solar system on our level of reality, but they originate from higher dimensions of the cosmos where there are more subtle energies. And people in different ancient cultures were familiar with these types of beings. They had different names for them: angels, devas, astral beings, Manitou. In different cultures, they have different names for them. But my concept of extraterrestrials includes these higher dimensional beings, in addition to flesh and blood type extraterrestrials, which I think also exist.
Mm-hmm. These higher dimensional beings, which I do believe, that's a possibility. I don't disagree with that concept. When they interacted with the human race, based on your research, did they take on a material form, or at least appear to be material, even if they appeared and then disappeared back to their own dimension?
Yeah, that can definitely happen. And here's another aspect of extraterrestrials. According to my way of thinking, we're all extraterrestrials in this sense. As conscious beings, we have an origin on some higher level of reality that I call the level of pure consciousness. Today, many scientists have the mistaken idea that matter produces consciousness in the brain. They would say, okay, if you organize the chemicals in the brain in a sufficiently complex way, they'll produce, this thing that we call consciousness. And at the time of death, when the chemicals in the brain become disorganized, they would say, okay, there's no more consciousness at that point. So they have a matter-based understanding of what a human being actually is. But as far as I'm concerned, consciousness has its own independent existence. It's not produced by chemicals in the brain. It can become associated with matter, but matter does not produce consciousness. So consciousness has an origin somewhere. I would say its origin, its original condition, is on what I call the level of pure consciousness, which is beyond the world of matter. And what happens is some conscious selves, they can, if they become egotistical, if they become selfish, they can't exist in the harmonious state that characterizes that level of pure consciousness. There has to be some other level of reality where they can act out their selfish desires. And that is the world of matter. And there they're given vehicles made of matter. That's what these bodies are. So I would say we're all extraterrestrials. We're all from that higher level of reality. Our origin as conscious beings is not this world of matter.
And when you have a perspective like that, it explains a lot of things that we know to be true from a subjective point of view, but cannot explain through science or physics because we don't, I'm going to say, have the technology to measure it. For example, ghosts. To me, ghosts are beings that live in a non-dimensional, non-three-dimensional realm. Out there with those ETs floating around in time and space.
It's kind of interesting. Earlier this year, I was on a lecture tour at universities in India, and I was talking about my forbidden archaeology topic and also some other topics, but I found one of the most common questions from students was, what about ghosts? Somehow or other, it's a topic that people are concerned about. And here's the way I would explain it. A human being, or any other living thing, as far as I'm concerned, is actually made of three things: matter, mind, and consciousness. In other words, there's a material body made of the chemical elements. Then there's a subtle mental body, which has some very unusual powers, like remote viewing and telekinesis, mind over matter. And then there's the conscious self, which is something different from matter, something different from mind. It's what animates the whole thing. So if an entity has a conscious self and just a subtle mental body, that would be a ghost. If you have a conscious self, a subtle mental body, and a gross physical body in which one can satisfy the desires that arise in the subtle mental body, then you're a human being like us. But sometimes, a person is put into a situation, usually, I would say a suicide, for example. They destroy their material body, and if you do that, then you're not very likely going to get another one. I believe in reincarnation. You go from one body to another until you get liberated from the whole cycle of birth and death. But say if a person destroys their own body, say if you have somebody gives you a car and then you just wreck it deliberately, that person who gave you the first car isn't likely going to give you a second one, because it's kind of been shown you don't appreciate it. So then you're kind of stuck. So similarly, here's what I think. If a person, this isn't the only way this could happen, but if you destroy your own body, then you don't get another gross physical body. You're kind of stuck with all your desires in a mental body. And that's why I think ghosts try to possess the bodies of people living in the world, because they have their subtle mental bodies full of all kinds of desires and no way to satisfy those desires. So they're kind of looking for bodies that they can control, and that results in cases of possession.
That's an interesting viewpoint of it. I mean, because then they're just kind of stuck in this gray zone, not being able to come back into this world, but not being able to get another body. And let me ask this question. I thought that, based on the whole concept of reincarnation, that if you did do something like commit suicide, that you would just get kind of a crappy body so that you could, balance out the karma of what you did in your prior lifetime.
Well, that may happen. I mean, there's no hard and fast rules, but there's some definite statements in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India that, in particular, suicides are very liable to attain ghostly bodies. Now, as far as the type of body that a person would get in the next life, that depends how they live this life. In this life, people, we see some people are being very kind, very considerate. They're helping other people. They're, in other words, they're not being selfish. They're not trying to exploit people. They're not behaving in what we might say an inhumane way. If somebody behaves in a very inhumane way, I mean, sometimes we even say, oh, that person is just a dog or a hog, behaving like an animal, then if that is really the case, then such a person in their next life, their reincarnation, may get the body of a lower species than the human species. So that's how I look at that question.
Mm-hmm.
And just from the scientific point of view, there have been studies and past life regressions and recovered memories, reincarnation memories, past life memories. They've been studied by psychiatrists like Ian Stevenson and his colleagues. Of course, Ian Stevenson's no longer living, but some of his followers are continuing that line of research, past life memories and things like that. So there are some scientific studies that are consistent with the idea of reincarnation or past lives.
It sounds like if you were contemplating the idea of suicide, I mean, God forbid, on the one hand, it gets you off the cycle of rebirth, but it definitely doesn't sound like it sends you to nirvana. So you're not really getting what you really want, which is relief from the torment that you were experiencing in life.
No, you're just, it's not going to result in that. And in traditional Indian culture, there is a ritual that people perform. It's called Shraddha. And sometimes they go to a specific place in India, Gaya, to perform, this ritual. And the reason they do it is if any of their relatives or ancestors have gotten themselves in a position where they're in that ghost level of reality, the fact that some of their descendants perform this ritual frees them from that so that they get another birth and another chance, to achieve real liberation from the cycle of birth and death, by using the human vehicle for its proper purpose, which is ultimately self-realization. That is, according to ancient Indian thought and spirituality, the real purpose of human life, to satisfy our material needs in the most simple, natural, and efficient way possible while putting most of our human energy into self-realization, understanding that as conscious beings, we are meant to be free from the cycle of birth and death. So that's the ultimate purpose of yoga and meditation and all kinds of spiritual disciplines.
These, I'm going to say, subtle energy extraterrestrial beings, would they also be outside of the cycle of birth and death because they're not incarnating into a physical body, or do they go through their own cycle of birth and death, thus helping them to move up to an even purer level?
I would say it's something like that. They haven't attained nirvana or liberation from material reality. They're still caught up in that. But I think it's more like what you're saying. I think you've put it in a very nice way.
Let's kind of shift our focus. I'm like, there's a couple, there's what I thought we were going to talk about, and then there's what we're talking about. One of the things that,
you started.
I know. But kind of keeping in this ET line and in the Hindu tradition, there are millions of gods in the Hindu tradition, but let's just keep it simple. Indira is one of their chief gods. But then there's Vishnu, another chief god. And so in this kind of hierarchy of subtle energy being versus a physical being, I mean, do you think that Indira was a physical being where Vishnu, it seems to me he was more of a subtle energy being, or is Vishnu really like the creator god that we have no name no way to describe kind of thing. How did these gods fit into this pattern of body, no body?
All right. To explain it, we have to understand there are three basic levels of reality according to this cosmology. There's the level of pure consciousness or spirit. Then there's the level of subtle matter, of mental and intellectual energies. And then there's the level of gross physical matter, the chemical elements. So there's God with a capital G is singular and exists on that higher level of spiritual reality, which I call the level of pure consciousness. There are technical words for it in Sanskrit, like Brahman, the Brahman level of reality. It means the level of reality that's beyond all types of gross and subtle material energies. And that's where we're originally from as conscious beings. We exist there in harmony with the source of all conscious beings, God with a capital G if you like, and in harmony with all other conscious beings. Now, some conscious selves, they become egotistical, they become selfish, they want to be, dominate everybody and everything. So they can no longer exist in that harmonious state. So there has to be some other level of reality or other levels of reality for them to exist. So those who have a controlling mentality, but they're still basically kind of good, they exist as gods with a little g on the level of the subtle material energies. And there you will find, according to the Vedic cosmology, the gods like Indra and Brahma and Shiva and so on, so many of them. There's a sun god, a moon god. So these controllers who are basically still kind of good, but they're selfish, but they're good, they exist on that level of reality. Vishnu is from the spiritual level of reality. The Vishnu, according to the particular spiritual path that I follow, is God with a capital G on that topmost level of spiritual reality. The demigods, gods with a small g, who are controllers of various aspects of material reality, exist on that level of subtle matter. And then there's the level of gross matter, where we find ourselves now, ordinary, human beings and plants and animals and things like that. So they're like controllers of this level of reality. But they're not God with a capital G. That's... It's like if you have, say, a prison house. You've got the prisoners in it, but you've got the warden and guards and people who are running it, you could say. But then there's life beyond the prison, the free society. So you can say the spiritual world's like the free society, and the material world is like the little prison house for the reformation of the conscious selves who really have disqualified themselves from existing on the topmost spiritual level of reality, and kind of managing that whole system are these demigods like Indra and so on.
So basically we're all just kind of screwed.
Well,
but I thought we chose this.
Because,
I thought we chose to be here.
It's that we've screwed ourselves, you could say. Now, there are two types of conscious selves existing on this level of reality. There's one type of conscious self who's trying to understand, okay, I'm a being of pure consciousness. all others are beings of pure consciousness. There's no need to be fighting amongst ourselves, dividing ourselves into so many different groups and fighting and competing and trying to, exploit and dominate and control matter to the maximum extent possible. That's one type of person. And that's what you might say the good person. Then there's the type of person who's trying to get more and more deeply entangled in the competition, the domination, the control, the exploitation, everything like that. Destroying the environment, causing wars, financial crises, and all this stuff. That is one type of person. And then the other type of person is trying to come to some higher level of understanding and action. So the type of world that we live in is going to depend upon the percentages of people who are in each category. And unfortunately, at the present moment, those who seem to want to get more and more deeply entangled in dominating, controlling, and exploiting matter and other persons seem to have the upper hand at the present moment. Now, we can each kind of create our own private realities, in terms of our lives and the people that we associate with, but in terms of the larger world that we exist on at the present moment, those who are on the path of increasing the domination, control, exploitation, competition, conflict over matter are now pretty much in the dominant position, which means the world isn't a very pleasant place at the present moment. It can change, but requires more people changing their consciousness.
Hear, hear. Okay, now we're really going to shift gears and talk about the antiquity of mankind. So one of the things that you mentioned was about cycles of time. And one of the things that I think gets people really confused, especially, you watch the shows about 2012 and they talk about the Yuga cycle. But when you really start looking at cycles of time in Hindu cosmology, it seems like the reality of the history on this planet goes much deeper to a bigger cycle of time, the Kalpa. And would you agree with that understanding?
Yes, I would.
Excuse my phonics. Those Indian words are like.
No, you're pronouncing them. You're pronouncing them correctly. No problem. I understand perfectly what you're talking about. According to, like I said a little earlier in the show, there's a lot of traditional cultures that have the idea of cyclical time. And just even in our ordinary sense of time, we have cycles. We have the year, which is a cycle, which is broken into 12 months, which is, months are broken into 4 weeks. Weeks are broken into 7 days. So there's kind of cycles within cycles within cycles. And the ancient Indian cosmology is similar. There are cycles within cycles within cycles. So the larger cycle, or one of the larger cycles, is called the Kalpa, or the Day of Brahma, and it lasts for about 4 billion years, roughly. And according to the Vedic cosmological calendar, we're about halfway through the present Kalpa right now. And a Kalpa is divided into 14 subcycles called manvantars, and they each last about 300 million years. According to the Vedic cosmological calendar, we're now in the 7th manvantar of the present Kalpa. That means there have been 6 manvantars before us. And each manvantar cycle ends with a devastation that depopulates the Earth. So, sometimes people are wondering in December 2012, is there going to be a big cosmic devastation as was depicted in a Hollywood film some years ago? No, I don't think so. That's coming, but it's not coming anytime soon.
It's not next week, right?
So, according to the Vedic cosmological calendar, in terms of the current Manvantar that we're in, it began about 120 million years ago, and it will end in about 180 million years. And at that time, there will be a kind of devastation that will wipe out life on Earth. But what happens after these devastations is that from higher levels in the cosmos, the Earth is repopulated, and then another Manvantar begins. So, as I said, a kalpa is divided into 14 Manvantars. We're now in the 7th, and that means there have been 6 before us, and that would mean 6 devastations. I think it's kind of interesting. If you look at modern paleontology, they say that in the history of life, over the past 2 billion years, there have been 6 major extinction events. The last one being the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. So I think it's kind of interesting that according to the ancient Indian cosmology and modern science, there have been 6 big extinction events in the history of life on Earth over the past couple of billion years, which would kind of correspond to the kalpa and the different manvantars and the devastations that have taken place. And then a manvantar is divided into 71 cycles of 4 yugas, which you've also mentioned. So you've got cycles within cycles within cycles. So according to the Vedic cosmological calendar, we're now in the Kali Yuga of the 28th Yuga cycle of the 7th Manvantar of the current Kalpa. So, cycles within cycles within cycles.
You definitely need a piece of paper to figure that one out.
Yeah, just like, we would say now we're in the 3rd week of the month of April of the year 2012 of the current century, it's like that. Cycles within cycles within cycles.
And this is just a commentary, and then I'm going to move on. It makes me laugh. Before we were coming on, I was talking about a new book I'm working on, and what got me started on the whole topic were these shows about 2012, and they would say, well, the Mayan calendar says this, and it's like, well, in Hindu tradition, they say a similar thing. So I started, digging into the Hindu tradition as far as these cycles of time, and they don't say the same thing. It's kind of like they're telling a little white lie on TV, but it has to be true because it was on TV.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, I'm going to talk about this topic, the relationship of the ancient Indian time cycles to the Mayan time cycles on a cruise that's going to some of the Mayan sites in 2012. I'm going to be a speaker on that cruise. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. It's an interesting topic. The thing that they have in common, the time concepts, is that they are cyclical, but the cycles don't exactly match up in terms of their length and what's expected, to happen.
Right.
So there are some differences. There are some similarities. The basic one being vast cycles of cyclical time, but as you're pointing out, the nature of the cycles, the length of them, they're somewhat different.
So based on these much longer periods of time, has there been any evidence uncovered that supports these much older dates? Most people believe that civilization started, 3500 BC, and, yeah, we had little colonies and villages here and there are some stone tools, but is there evidence of a higher society that existed prior to, I'll say, the current Yuga cycle, or I forget the other word that you used, it wasn't the Kalpa, the Maya something.
The Manvantar.
Yeah, that
cycle.
one.
Well, first of all, we should understand that even according to the modern understanding is there aren't any human beings until 200,000 years ago. And then they think there were just hunter-gatherers. They think the first village life, first simple settled village life began about 10,000 or 12,000 years ago. And then they think the first cities, civilizations, came into existence about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. So when we hear these ancient Sanskrit writings talking about people existing millions of years ago, that's the first thing. So there is evidence that, I've documented in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, there's evidence in the form of human footprints, human bones, showing that humans did exist millions and millions of years ago, as stated in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. And as far as evidence of, say, more advanced cultures, the first thing is, if you're going to have any level of human culture, high or low, first of all, you've got to have human beings. And I think I've shown that human beings have existed for millions and millions of years. Now, in terms of evidence for what their level of culture is, that sometimes is a little harder to find, because a lot of the stuff that we consider to be signs of advanced culture really doesn't last very long in the layers of the earth over millions and millions of years. Metal things will oxidize. One reason we consider gold very valuable is that gold doesn't oxidize like most metals do. So that means gold will preserve over millions of years. It won't rust away, like something made of iron or steel would. So there have been some interesting reports of very ancient gold objects having been found. For example, in the year 1892, there was a report in the Morrisonville Times, a newspaper from Morrisonville, Illinois, that a woman named Mrs. Robert Culp was putting a big piece of coal into her coal-burning stove, and it broke in half. And inside the piece of coal, she found a gold chain 10 inches long. So that was really pretty interesting. From that report, I was able to find out what mine the coal came from. And I got in touch with modern geologists in the state of Illinois from the government geological agency, the State Geological Survey of Illinois. And I asked them, well, how old is the coal from that place? And they said, okay, it's about 300 million years old. So that would be from the previous Manvantar period. As I said, we're now in the 7th Manvantar period of the present Kalpa, and this 300 million years ago would be from the previous Manvantar period. And to put it in the perspective of modern science, it would be from before the time of the dinosaurs, even. So there's a beautiful gold chain, which means people had to have some level of sophistication to do that. So, there is some evidence of higher levels of culture coming before the present Manvantar period. In other words, hundreds of millions of years ago. Now, there are two ways to learn about the past. One is what we can find in the layers of the earth, and the other is what we can find in the writings of the ancient civilizations. And the writings of ancient Indian civilization give descriptions of cities that existed hundreds of millions of years ago, spacecraft, weapons resembling modern nuclear weapons, advanced scientific knowledge such as the ability to count time according to the movement of atoms. So these things did exist millions and millions of years ago. The historical records are there. There is scientific evidence in the form of evidence of human fossils that existed hundreds of millions of years ago, and even some cultural artifacts, like the gold chain, for example.
Do you think that the, and I'm going to say quote-unquote, human artifacts were human, or do you think they were, and I hate to say it this way, but humanoid?
I would call them human because there's evidence that humans like us were also existing. For example, there was a scientific report from a scientific journal called The Geologist that in Macoupin County, Illinois, a human skeleton was found 90 feet below the surface of the ground, and directly above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock that extended for hundreds of yards in all directions, and this thick layer of slate rock was unbroken. Because this is sometimes, what skeptical people will say, well, maybe the skeleton slipped down into this ancient layer, by some fissure, but the fact that there was a solid layer of slate rock, several feet thick, that was unbroken, and it was above the skeleton, shows that you can't explain it by that way. So according to modern geologists, at this place, at that level, below the slate rock, the formation that the human skeleton was found in was about 300 million years old, the same age as the gold chain that was found in another part of Illinois. Now, there was a medical doctor who examined the skeleton, and he said it was human. So I would say that. Now, I don't deny that there may have been alongside, the human beings, other humanoid creatures, more subtle beings, extraterrestrials, all types of, I don't deny that. But there is evidence that humans like us were existing in these very ancient times. So that's how I would look at it.
Wouldn't you just love to get some DNA of that skeleton, viable DNA? That'd be interesting.
Well, that would be. Now, that's just my opinion. Now, I'm happy to let people try to explain these things in whatever way makes most sense to them. Say, some of the ancient artifacts that I write about in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, some people have gotten the idea, well, maybe they were left by extraterrestrials, or maybe they were left by time travelers, or, I'm happy that people think about all different possibilities to explain these things. But if I'm asked about my opinion, I say, well, those things may be possible, but I think another possibility, and the one that I favor, is that these things were made by humans like us who lived in very ancient times, millions and millions of years ago, on this planet.
And it's a viable theory. There's not anything out there to say it's not true. I mean, there's a lot of people saying a lot of things that you look at the evidence and you put out an opinion. I mean, that's the only thing that you can do because, God's not coming down and dishing up the story.
Yeah, I mean, people have to make their own decisions about, these things. I think there is such a thing as divine revelation. I do accept that. I mean, but the question is, for people who don't accept, that, okay, some ancient book of knowledge is divinely inspired, they want to know, is there any evidence for the ideas that are expressed, say, in the ancient traditions? I think, yes, there is evidence, and that can be considered. That's why I wrote the book Forbidden Archaeology, for example. Say, as far as I'm concerned, just in terms of my spiritual path, for me, just a statement from the ancient Sanskrit writings of India that humans existed on this planet millions of years ago, it's sufficient for me in one sense, but not, maybe some other people, they're not just going to accept a statement in the Bible or the Koran or the ancient Sanskrit writings of India as evidence of anything. They just might think, well, that's just mythology in the sense of the word that means imaginary.
But in the same breath, you have done a lot of research into this area and looked at what we know, what we don't know, to come to a conclusion that what you're reading in those texts seems, true or reliably true, or at least something that you should put out there versus someone that's just believing it because they read it and they have no personal internal evidence to support it.
Right. So I've taken that, step of trying to give people reasons why, they might seriously consider some of the statements that are in these ancient wisdom traditions. Because many modern scientists are just going to just say, well, no, we can't consider that. For example, if there's a statement, there's the conscious self can exist apart from the body. Many scientists today are simply going to say, well, that's not true because consciousness is produced by chemicals in the brain. So if I can offer them some scientific evidence that consciousness can exist apart from the body, there are medical studies of out-of-body experiences, for example, that tend to show that consciousness can exist outside the body. Or if there's an idea in an ancient wisdom tradition that humans have existed millions of years ago, well, there's archaeological evidence to support that. So my goal would be to get people to take the statements that are made in the writings of these ancient wisdom traditions a little more seriously rather than simply dismissing them.
I believe, and I firmly believe this is that what we have received from these ancient wisdom traditions is far more advanced than what we currently know in science, and science still has not caught up with what they tell us.
I agree with you.
In a lot of different areas.
I agree 100%.
I mean, when you talk, in physics about non-locality and the opportunity of consciousness to be in more than one location at the same time, and I'm like, been there, done that. Old news if you, have looked into these spiritual traditions. It's like, and you don't need science to support it because you know it from a subjective perspective or from other evidence, anyway. Okay, so we have about 4 minutes left. All right, so I'm just going to ask, I have a question. I mean, we've been talking about the cycles of time, and one of the things that I have found confusing, and maybe you can clear up since, I love picking your brain, is, and I'm going to say his name wrong, but I'm going to try really hard, Mastia, the fish, Mastya. Mastia.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the things that confuses me is that this character shows up both at the end of the last Kalpa as well as the beginning of the Satya Yuga. Any thoughts on why? Like, is there a mistake somewhere?
Well, there can be repeated appearances of these avatars. They're called avatars. Avatar means one who descends from some higher level for some purpose. So these avatars of Vishnu, of which Matsya is one, appear not just once but repeatedly in these different cycles of time. So, that's how I would explain it. They may appear at the beginning of a kalpa, at the beginning of a manvantar, at the beginning of a yuga. They exist on some higher level of reality and repeatedly manifest on this level of reality for different purposes at different times.
Okay. It is just a little bit confusing because in one side you're going, okay, well, this is tied to this is tied to this. How do you keep, when you start looking at mythology, with Hindu mythology not being any different, there are a lot of overlapping stories, or, you read the same story, but there's 4 different versions, and it gets confusing.
That can happen, yes.
So, one quick question. I hear that you're going to be at Megalomythomania coming up in a couple of weeks, and you were talking about your cruise, so maybe you could share with the listeners some of the speaking events you have coming up and where they can get information, et cetera, et cetera.
The best place to go for information is the schedule link on my website, mcremo.com, mcremo.com. For example, this Friday I'm speaking at Stanford University. The information about that is on my website. Early in May 12th, I'll be speaking at the Megalomythomania Conference in Glastonbury, England, which is a very interesting place for any of my readers or people who are interested in my work who might be in that area in England in May. And then in December 2012, there's that cruise that I'll be on, going to some of the Mayan sites in Central America. And if anybody's interested in, of course, if they've gone to my website and looked at the interview schedule, they would have seen this interview. So anyone who's interested in any of my upcoming speaking events or interviews, media interviews, can check my website, mcremo.com, mcremo.com. And then I also have a Facebook page, Twitter, at Michael Cremo, and lots of ways to get in touch with me.
The whole networking ensemble.
Yeah, and I'm very happy to be on your show because I think we're all doing our parts to advance the cause of human knowledge, and it's great that there are opportunities like you're providing. And it's great to be part of this whole elevation of human consciousness that's going on this planet now.
Well, and I think that there's a lot of information that has been shrouded in mystery for a very long time that is finally coming up to the surface. Thank God. Anyway, well, the music's going to come up here in a second. So, Michael, thank you for coming on. It is always a pleasure. And, we'll have you back. That's a no-brainer. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Bye, Michael.
Bye-bye.
That was Michael Cremo. His webpage is mcremo.com. The other one is forbiddenarchaeology.com. Buy his books. Really cool guy. After the break, we'll be back with Daniel Brinkley talking about 2012, the changing face of time. We'll be back in a minute.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.